My name is Alistair Fernsby, and I am the last true bearer of that surname. At least that's how I feel. Technically, it still lives in my son, but he has long been more a member of his wife's family than of our ancient, though almost extinct, family. This morning I woke up, as usual, at 6 o'clock sharp. The habit of early rising has remained from the days when the workshop demanded my attention at first light. The light in Easton in the summer is special, soft, diffuse, perfect for fine work. Perfect lighting for the taxidermist I've been for nearly 40 years. Now in my 67th, I still wake up early, though the need to do so is no longer necessary. My house on the outskirts of Easton now seems too spacious for one person. Since Eleanor's death 5 years ago, every room has become a museum of memories. Her things, her smells, all gradually weathered away, no matter how hard I try to preserve traces of our lives. Today is a special day, the first Saturday in July when the Fernsbys traditionally gather for a family barbecue. Once upon a time, when my parents were still alive, it was truly a family event. 3 generations, cousins, aunts and uncles, the whole clan. Now it's just the three of us, me, my son Barnaby, and his wife Ottilia, who is only Fernsby on paper. I slowly brew my tea in an old porcelain teapot I got from my grandmother. They say the name Fernsby comes from an ancient settlement, somewhere in Yorkshire, where our ancestors lived before the Norman conquest. Maybe it's just a family legend, but I believe it. There aren't many things left to believe in when you're over 60 and alone. Glancing at the calendar, I mentally prepare myself for the day ahead. For the third year in a row, our barbecue has been held at Barnaby and Attilia's home, an imposing 3-story mansion in an upscale Easton neighborhood. After I retired, Ottilia insisted that my modest house was not suitable for a decent event. Well, she knows how to get her way. I open my closet, contemplating what to wear. Ottilia always wrinkles her nose when I come in wearing my favorite plaid shirt. "Alistair, this isn't a trip to the village pub," she says in the tone one usually uses with a naughty child. "But I bloody love this shirt. Eleanor gave it to me for our last anniversary." My thoughts are interrupted by a phone call. I know who it is before I even look at the screen. "Good morning, Denby," I say, picking up the phone. "Are you on your way to your aristocrats yet?" The voice of Denby Lawty, my old friend, sounds with the usual irony. "I'm trying to pick out the right outfit for the royal reception," I reply, grinning. Denby snorts, "Wear that plaid shirt. It's driving your sister-in-law crazy." "That's exactly why I'm considering it." We both laugh. Denby is the only person I can be completely honest with. We've known each other for almost 50 years, dating back to the days when he worked as an antiques appraiser and regularly stopped by my workshop. Occasionally, wealthy clients would ask for stuffed animals for their trophies, and Denby would refer them to me. Thus began our decades-long friendship. "Are you ready for the annual Fake Smile Festival?" he asks. I sigh, sinking into the old chair by the window. "The usual. Sometimes I think it would be easier to just stop going there and deprive myself of the pleasure of seeing Ottilia trying to hide her disappointment that you're still alive and well. No way, old friend." I smile, but something inside clenches. It's just the way it is. My sister-in-law can't wait for old Alistair Fernsby to give her some living space. Or maybe not just space. My house, though not as luxurious as their mansion, sits on a substantial plot of land. In Easton, real estate gets more expensive every year. "Remember how different everything was after they moved in 3 years ago?" I ask, looking out the window at my manicured garden. "I bet you do. New house, new friends, new Ottilia. Suddenly an expert on everything in the world." I nod, though Denby can't see it. Memory takes me back to the day I helped Barnaby with the move. Ottilia was in her element, bossing the movers around, telling them where to put things, making endless remarks. She sent me to sort through the books in the study, apparently believing it to be a safe enough task for an old man. I remember going through the volumes, carefully arranging them on the shelves, when I came across a cardboard folder piled behind a row of books. Opening it out of sheer curiosity, I saw some official documents, photos of strangers, newspaper clippings. Nothing special, at least that's what it seemed to me at the time. But Ottilia's reaction when she caught me with the folder was unexpected. "What are you doing?" Her voice sounded harsh, almost frightened. "Just sorting through the books like you asked," I replied, a little surprised at her tone. This is private. She snatched the folder out of my hands. I asked you to only deal with the books. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. But she didn't listen to me and quickly left the office with the folder under her arm. At that time, I didn't pay much attention to it. There's no telling what kind of documents people might have that they don't want to show to outsiders. Although it would seem, what kind of outsider am I? I'm her husband's father, grandfather of her future children. Hey, you still there? Denby's voice brings me back to reality. Yeah, I was just thinking. About what? About the day they moved in. You know, there was something weird. I tell Denby the story about the file. He chuckles. Interesting. What do you think might have been in there? I have no idea. Tax returns? Medical reports? Letters from an ex-lover? I shrug, even though Denby can't see it. Anyway, that was 3 years ago. I would have forgotten about it long ago if it weren't for her reaction. We discuss the upcoming barbecue some more. Then I say goodbye. I have to finish packing. I decide to wear the light blue shirt instead of the plaid one. I don't want to start the day with a confrontation. Before I leave, I go into my old studio. Now it's more of a museum than a workspace. Dozens of stuffed animals stare at me with glassy eyes, from tiny songbirds to an imposing deer proudly displaying its antlers. Each one is a piece of my life, a story of painstaking labor and craftsmanship. I run my hand over the smooth fur of a fox, one of my best works. People don't understand taxidermy. They see it as something dark, creepy. But for me, it's always been an art of preserving beauty. I didn't kill these animals. I gave them new life, saved them from oblivion. Ottilia, of course, always wrinkled her nose when she came into my studio. A graveyard of dead animals, I once heard her whisper to her friend. Barnaby pretended not to hear. He always pretends not to hear when his wife says something hurtful about me. My son. We used to be so close. I taught him everything I knew. Not taxidermy, no. He never had any interest in my craft. But fishing, carpentry, how to recognize the stars in the night sky. He was an inquisitive boy with a good heart. But ever since Ottilia came into his life, something had changed. Gradually, year after year, he drifted away. First he called every day, then once a week, now only on special occasions. I'd take my gift from the table for tonight's barbecue, a bottle of good scotch. Ottilia prefers expensive wine, but it's a Fernsby family tradition to have a good whiskey for toasting. At least it was that way under my father and his father before him. The gift, the car, the road, the usual. A 20-minute drive from my quiet neighborhood to their upscale neighborhood. Every time I approach their house, I feel the muscles in my neck and shoulders tense up. I don't know if it's noticeable from the outside, but inside I'm preparing myself as if for battle. Before I get out of the car, I look at myself in the rearview mirror. The wrinkles have gotten deeper. My hair has almost completely grayed. The last Fernsby, I whisper to my reflection. Then I straighten my back, grab a bottle of whiskey, and get out of the car. Barnaby opens the door before I can even ring the bell. He's always been observant. Daddy! His smile seems genuine, and for a moment I see him as the boy I taught to cast a fishing rod. You're early. Am I? I look at my watch. It's only 20 minutes. Of course, it's nothing. It's just that Ottilia isn't quite ready yet. You know how she likes everything to be perfect. I nod, holding out the bottle to him. A traditional gift. Thank you. He takes the whiskey with some embarrassment. Though Ottilia ordered some special wine for tonight, but I'll be sure to open it later with friends. What friends? I'm tempted to ask. All of his old buddies have long since been crossed off his wife's suitable acquaintances list. We walk into the living room and I'm struck again by how cold and impersonal it looks. Like a page from a fashion magazine, not a place where people live. Everything is perfect, everything in its place, not a single personal photograph or little thing that speaks of the people who live here. Ottilia will be down in a minute, Barnaby said, clearly uncomfortable. Shiwanar, would you like something to drink? A glass of water, please. He goes into the kitchen and I'm alone. I look around the room absent-mindedly, thinking that in a few hours it will be filled with people I barely know. Ottilia's co-workers, her right acquaintances, as she calls them. None of the old family friends, none of the people Barnaby grew up with. I feel the anxiety that has become a familiar companion to these visits. How many times during the evening will I have to smile in response to condescending comments about my exotic profession? How many times will I be forced to swallow another of Ottilia's barbs disguised as a joke? My musings are interrupted by the clatter of heels on the stairs. Ottilia comes down, impeccably dressed, with perfect hair and a smile that never reaches her eyes. "Ellister," she exclaims in a tone that mixes surprise with slight disappointment. "You are so early. We did not expect guests until 3 o'clock." "I apologize," I reply. "I wanted to offer my help with the arrangements." "Oh, no need to worry." Her smile becomes strained. "We have everything under control. The caterer will be here at 2 o'clock, and they'll do everything." Catering. Of course they will. What's a barbecue without professional chefs? It's not like the old days when I grilled my own steaks and Eleanor made her famous potato salad. "You can relax in the garden for a while," Ottilia continued. "Barnaby will show you our new roses. We've recently completely redone the landscaping. It's her way of letting me know I'm not needed in the house while preparations are being made. Well, it's better that way. Less time with her." When Barnaby and I step out into the garden, I can't help but marvel. It really is beautiful. Immaculate lawns, exquisite flower arrangements, a small ornamental pond with Japanese carp. "It's beautiful," I say sincerely. "Ottilia worked with the best landscaper in Easton," Barnaby says proudly. "You know, she comes from a family that's always appreciated the finer things in life. Her father was an art collector." I nod, not wanting to start an argument. I've heard so many times about Ottilia's aristocratic background, her impeccable upbringing, how her family lost its fortune but kept its manners and connections. Sometimes I think Barnaby believes this tale himself. We walk in silence along the rose bushes. I notice my son looks tired, the shadows under his eyes, the tense line of his shoulders. "How was work?" I ask, trying to make conversation. "It's fine. Lots of new project," he answers briefly without detail. "How's your promotion? You said last time—" "It didn't work out," he cuts me off. "They cut the department's budget." I want to ask more, but I sense that he's in no mood to discuss the subject. We keep walking, and a heavy silence hangs between us. We used to be able to talk for hours, but now we can hardly find topics for a 5-minute conversation. "How is your health?" he finally asks. "Not bad for my age," I answer with a smile. "My blood pressure is a little high sometimes, but nothing serious." He nods with visible relief. I'm pretty sure Ottilia had him check to see if I'm going to the afterlife anytime soon. "You know," I say, deciding to change the subject, "I recently found some old photos. You're fishing with my father. Remember how he taught you how to cast a trolling rod?" Barnaby's face brightens. "Of course I remember. Grandpa always said I was born with a fishing rod in my hands." For a moment I see a glimpse of the Barnaby I used to know, but the moment quickly passes. Ottilia's voice comes from inside the house, calling him. "I have to go," he says with an apologetic smile. "Why don't you sit here? I'll get you something to drink." And so I'm alone again, sitting on a bench in someone else's garden, preparing for another evening of pretense and awkward conversations. Denby's voice sounds in my head. "You're the last real Fernsby, old boy. Don't forget that." I look at my hands, the hands of a master craftsman who created hundreds of works of art from what others thought was just dead flesh. These hands remember the warmth of little Barnaby's palm as I led him on his first day of school. They remember Eleanor's touch on our last day together. Soon the place will be full of people. The annual Happy Fernsby family play will begin, and I'll play my part, as I always do. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the garden was filled with guests. I sat on the sidelines watching the expensive cars pull up, out of which people with impeccably styled hair and white-toothed smiles emerge. All of them dressed as if they were at a cocktail party rather than a barbecue. The men in light pastel-colored summer suits, the women in silk dresses and pearl strings around their necks. There was not a single familiar face here. Not Graham Porter, whom Barnaby had been friends with since school, nor the Hill couple who lived in the next street and looked after Barnaby when Eleanor and I worked late. None of the people who had made up our family circle over the years. Ottilia flitted between the guests like a glowing butterfly, flitting from one group to the next, Her light blue dress perfectly accentuated her figure, and in the afternoon sunlight, her golden hair seemed almost radiant. I had to hand it to her. She knew how to make an impression. "Daddy," Barnaby came over to me with 2 glasses. "Here, try this wine." Ottilia ordered it especially for tonight. I took a glass, though I would have preferred a glass of whiskey. "Thank you, lots of guests." "Yes," he looked around the garden. "Mostly Ottilia's colleagues from the city administration and a few people from my office." "I don't see any of our old acquaintances," I said in as neutral a tone as possible. Barnaby shrugged embarrassedly. "We wanted to invite the Porters, but they're away for the weekend." "And the Hills?" "I don't know. Ottilia decided the garden wasn't big enough, so we had to limit the guest list." I glanced at the spacious garden, which could easily have held 100 more people, but I didn't say anything. There was no point in starting this conversation. We both knew the truth. Barnaby's old friends aren't status enough for his new life. "Honey," Ottilia's voice cut through the air like a crystal bell, "introduce me to your colleague's father." Barnaby apologized and hurried to his wife. I was left alone sipping the wine, which seemed too sour. Or maybe it was my mood that was making everything around me sour. Gradually, the space around me filled up. People nodded politely, but no one lingered for conversation. I was like an invisible man, too old, too ordinary for this brilliant company. Finally, one of the women, a slender brunette in her 40s, stopped beside me. "You must be Barnaby's father," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Helena Turner. I work with Ottilia in administration." "Alistair Fernsby." I shook her hand. "It's nice to meet you. Ottilia has told me so much about you," she continued with a smile that seemed genuine. "She says you're a real artist." I raised my eyebrows in surprise. Had Ottilia really said something positive about me? Well, I wouldn't call myself an artist. I'm a taxidermist. Was a taxidermist, now retired. "Oh," her eyes widened. "That's interesting. I'm not quite sure what it is, I must admit." Before I could explain, Ottilia materialized next to me. She took Helena under her arm and said with a strained smile, "Helena, dear, I see you've met Alistair. He makes stuffed dead animals. It's such an, unusual hobby, isn't it?" "It's been my profession for 40 years, I corrected him, "and I wouldn't call it a hobby." Of course, Ottilia waved it away. "Anyway, Helena, James is looking for you. Something to do with that new project." Helena apologized and left. Ottilia lingered, giving me an appraising look. "You could wear something more appropriate," she said, nodding at my blue shirt and dark pants. "I thought it was quite formal for a barbecue." "This isn't just a barbecue, Alistair. There are important people here. The deputy mayor, for instance." "I didn't know you had to cook steaks for the deputy mayor in a tuxedo." Her eyes narrowed. "Always so witty. Just please, try not to tell your guests about your experiments with dead animals. Some might find it repulsive." With those words, she departed, leaving me feeling like I had just been put in my place like a naughty child. I took a sip of wine and noticed that the glass was almost empty. I decided to fill it up, if only to keep my hands busy. At the drinks table, I met a middle-aged man with a neatly trimmed beard. He introduced himself as Roger Banks, Barnaby's co-worker. "So you're Barnaby's father," he said, pouring himself a whiskey. "He's a fine man. You must be proud of him." "I am," I replied sincerely. "He's always been very responsible. You know, he recently saved our project on Oak Street. He spotted a critical error in the calculations that even the senior engineers missed." I smiled, feeling a warm wave of fatherly pride. These were the kinds of conversations I missed. Learning about my son's accomplishments, about his real life, not the superficial gloss with which Ottilia surrounded their existence. Roger and I were discussing construction projects in Easton when a group of other guests joined us. Ottilia reappeared nearby, with a glass of champagne in her hand. "Roger," she exclaimed, "I see you've met Father Barnaby." "Yes, we were just discussing—" "Alistair is a master of his craft," Ottilia interrupted him. "He makes stuffed animals so lifelike, you can't tell the difference. Can you imagine? He has a whole room in his house filled with dead creatures." Her tone was almost playful, but I sensed an undertone. She envisioned me as a local curiosity, something between a rural oddity and a Gothic character. "I was a taxidermist," I corrected again. "Ah, It's quite a complex craft, requiring knowledge of anatomy, chemistry, and sculpture. Oh, absolutely, Ottilia nodded theatrically. Ellister can talk for hours about how to properly disembowel a squirrel or a fox. A true expert. Several of the guests laughed nervously. I felt the color rush to my face. Actually, Roger began, clearly trying to lighten the mood, I've always found taxidermy very interesting from a scientific point of view. Our local museum has a great exhibit. Speaking of the museum, Attilia interrupted again, have you heard about the new modern art exhibit? Barnaby and I went to the opening last Thursday. Stunning work. And the conversation drifted toward art, culture, and whatever else Attilia thought were worthy topics of discussion. I stood silently, sipping my wine and feeling more and more out of place. Gradually, the party gained momentum. Professional chefs were grilling steaks on a huge grill. Waiters were serving appetizers and refilling drinks. Music pouring from discreetly placed speakers created an atmosphere of sophisticated fun. I moved around the garden, trying to remain inconspicuous. I caught a few glances from Barnaby, guilty, almost apologetic, but he was too busy playing the perfect host to his brilliant wife. Here comes our stuffed animal master. Ottilia's voice caught up with me by the pool. She stood with a group of women holding a glass of pink wine. Ellister, come here. My friends want to know about your exotic profession. I reluctantly approached. 5 pairs of curious eyes stared at me. Is it true that you dissect dead animals? Asked one of the women, a tall blonde woman in a red dress. I was a taxidermist, I said for the 3rd time that evening. I created museum pieces and hunting trophies. How does that work? The other woman asked with undisguised disgust in her voice. Do you cut them up? Taxidermy is the art of preserving and recreating the natural appearance of an animal. I began to explain. The process involves... Oh, don't go into detail, Ellister, Ottilia interrupted with a nervous chuckle. We've just eaten. You asked me to tell you, I said, feeling my patience beginning to fail. Yes, but we didn't expect such graphic details. I haven't said anything graphic yet. Ottilia smiled at her friends. Ellister sometimes forgets that not everyone shares his specific interests. My work was once exhibited at the National Museum of Natural History, I said, not hiding my irritation. I suppose quite a few people found them worth seeing. Of course, Ottilia patted my arm as if she were soothing a cranky child. Your scarecrows are very authentic, just a little intimidating for normal people. Her friends giggled. I felt something inside me tighten like the bowstring of a bow. I'd always considered myself a reserved person, but today Ottilia seemed determined to test my patience to the limit. By the way, she continued, turning to her friends, do you know that Ellister has never been abroad? Can you imagine, to live your whole life and not to see either Paris or Rome? Not everyone considers visiting tourist attractions a must for a fulfilling life, I replied. Oh, they're not tourist attractions, Ellister. They're cultural centers of the world. I understand, though. It's hard to appreciate the Louvre if your idea of art is limited to stuffing dead animals with sawdust. Her friends laughed again, more openly. I gritted my teeth, but I kept my mouth shut. I didn't want to make a scene in front of all these people. Barnaby wouldn't forgive me. Excuse me, I said finally. I need to refill my glass. I stepped back, feeling their stares and hearing the muffled laughter. My hands were trembling slightly with restrained anger. In a 40-year career, I'd created hundreds of exhibits that were admired by scientists and general museum goers. My work required the precision of a surgeon, the eye of an artist, and the patience of a monk. And now this woman, who has probably created nothing more significant than a successful selfie, allows herself to mock my life's work. At the drinks table, I met a man who introduced himself as Arthur Lynch, the deputy mayor. He was surprisingly pleasant to talk to. He asked about taxidermy with genuine interest and told me about his childhood spent in the countryside. For a few minutes, I almost forgot about the unpleasant incident with Ottilia. But the calm was short-lived. It was getting dark, and the decorative lanterns in the garden were lit, creating an almost magical atmosphere. The guests began to gather around the large table for the main dinner. I found my seat at the very end of the table, next to an elderly woman who, as it turned out, was the mother of one of Ottilia's colleagues. She hardly spoke at all, concentrating on her plate. Ottilia and Barnaby sat at the head of the table, surrounded by the most important guests. My son occasionally cast glances in my direction, but was too busy talking to Arthur Lynch sitting next to him. Dinner passed without incident until Ottilia rose for a toast. "I want to thank all of you for coming to share this beautiful evening with us," she began, holding up a glass of champagne. "I would especially like to acknowledge the presence of Arthur Lynch, who found time in his busy schedule." Applause, smiles, nods. "And of course, I'd like to welcome Barnaby's father, Alistair," she nodded in my direction, "who, despite his, um, conservative views on life, always supports us, in his own way." Several of the guests turned to me with polite smiles. I raised my glass, trying to maintain my dignity. "To family and friends," Ottilia finished her toast. "To family and friends," the guests echoed. After dinner, the company split into groups. Some returned to the pool, others settled on the comfortable garden sofas. I was left to myself again. I took a walk along the hedge that separated Barnaby's property from the neighboring house. "Minus Mr. Fernsby," a woman's voice called out to me. It was Victoria, one of Ottilia's friends, holding an almost empty wineglass. "Could you help me? I seem to have lost an earring somewhere by the pool." I agreed to help, although finding a small earring in the twilight seemed a hopeless endeavor. We returned to the pool where a rather large group of people, including Ottilia, had gathered. "What's wrong?" she asked when she saw us. "Victoria lost her earring," I explained. "I offered to help find it." "How kind of you," Ottilia smiled, but I could see something like irritation in her eyes. "Though it's unlikely you'll find anything in this light, maybe it's best to leave it until morning." "Aha, but those are my favorite earrings," Victoria objected. "My husband's anniversary present." "Of course we'll help," I said, and began to look around the pool. After a few minutes of searching, I noticed something shiny at the water's edge. I bent down to pick it up, and indeed it was a dainty silver earring with a small sapphire. "Found it," I said, straightening up. At that moment, Victoria, who was standing next to me, made a sharp movement with her hand with the glass. The dark red wine spilled out and got right on her light silk dress. "Oh my God!" she exclaimed. "My dress!" I stared at the blurry stain. I thought she'd knocked over the wine, but I wasn't sure. It had all happened so fast. "I'm sorry, I didn't—" "Look what you've done," Victoria interrupted me, though there was no real indignation in her voice, just a strange satisfaction. "Alistair!" Ottilia's indignant voice echoed over the pool. "Did you spill wine on Victoria's dress?" "No, I just—" But Ottilia wasn't listening. She approached her friend, theatrically examining the stain. "It's Valentino. It's worth more than—" She paused, but the end of the sentence was clear. "More than you earn in a month." "I didn't spill the wine," I said firmly. "But if I have to, I'll pay for the dry cleaning." "Dry cleaning?" Ottilia laughed, and her laughter was echoed by several guests around her. "It's silk, Alistair. You can't get a red wine stain out with dry cleaning." I was beginning to realize I'd been put in an impossible position. Victoria had accidentally spilled wine on herself, and now I was to be blamed. "That's what happens when you invite people who aren't used to normal society," Ottilia continued, addressing the crowd. "He spent his whole life among dead animals. How could he know how to behave with living people?" Someone chuckled nervously. I felt my cheeks burn, not with embarrassment, with anger. "That's enough, Ottilia," I said quietly but firmly. "I didn't spill the wine. And I know how to behave in public. Unlike some people." Her eyes narrowed. "What do you mean? I think you know perfectly well. All you've done all evening is humiliate me in front of your guests. I don't know what I've done to deserve it, but I'm sick of it." There was silence for a moment. Several of the guests averted their eyes, clearly uncomfortable. Barnaby, standing nearby, stepped forward, but Ottilia beat him to it. "That's it," she said with feigned sympathy. "You feel you are being humiliated. Poor Alistair, always so sensitive, always thinking he's the victim." "Ottilia," Barnaby said warningly, but she ignored him. "Do you know what I think?" She continued, taking a step toward me. "You just need to cool down a little." And before I realized what was happening, she put her hands on my chest and pushed. I lost my balance, and with a flutter of my arms, fell into the pool. The cold water closed in on me. I lost my bearings for a second, then came up spitting and breathing hard. Ottilia stood over the pool, smiling triumphantly. "Cool off, old man," she shouted in the garden filled with laughter. I saw some of the guests laugh outright, others out of politeness or embarrassment. Barnaby stood with a shocked expression on his face, not moving from his seat. I slowly swam to the edge of the pool and climbed out, feeling the water dripping off my clothes, the way they grew heavy on me, making every movement difficult. But heaviest of all was the realization my own son had done nothing to stop this humiliation. He just stood there and watched. Ottilia was still laughing, accepting congratulations from her friends as if she had just won some competition. Victoria, whose dress was the occasion for all of this, was smiling smugly, already forgetting about her favorite earring and ruined outfit. I stood there, soaked to the skin, feeling the water running down my face. Or maybe it was tears of anger. Without a word, I turned and walked away from the lot, leaving wet footprints behind me. "Daddy!" Barnaby finally came to his senses, catching up with me. "Wait, let me get you a towel, some dry clothes." "Don't bother," I said without turning around. "I'm leaving." "But you're all wet. How will you go?" "I'd rather be soaked to the skin than stay here another minute." "Dad, Ottilia didn't mean it. It was just a joke." I stopped and looked at my son. "A joke? Did you think it was funny, Barnaby? Publicly humiliating a man, pushing him into a pool and then laughing at him?" He lowered his eyes. "No, of course not. But she sometimes doesn't understand when she goes too far." "Ari, do you understand?" I asked quietly. "Do you realize that you let her treat me like that all night? That you didn't say a word when she made fun of me, my job, my whole life?" Barnaby was silent, and in that silence was the answer. "I'm leaving," I repeated. "Tell your wife I thank her for her hospitality." And I walked away, leaving wet footprints in the perfectly paved garden path. Behind me, I could still hear the laughter and the music. The party went on as if nothing had happened. I drove home, soaking wet, with drops of water dripping from my hair down my shirt collar. The car seat was instantly soaked, but I didn't care. There was such anger raging inside that I barely noticed the physical discomfort. My hands shook on the steering wheel, not from the cold, but from humiliation and rage. I saw Ottilia's face again and again, her triumphant smile as I floundered in the water. I heard the laughter of the guests and her shrill voice. "Cool off, old man." Old man. That's what I was to her. A useless, decrepit old man to be made a mockery of for the amusement of her empty-headed friends. When I got home, I just sat in the car for a while, gathering my strength. The old wound in my knee, a memory of a long-ago fall while hunting, was starting to whimper from the wet clothes and stress. But worse than the physical pain was the realization that my own son was just standing there, watching his wife humiliate me. Finally, I forced myself out of the car and into the house, dropped my wet shoes in the hallway, and leaving wet footprints behind me, walked straight to the bathroom. I pulled off my soaked clothes, tossing them in a corner. "I'll deal with it later." I stood under the hot shower, letting the water wash away not only the chlorine from the pool, but also, it seemed, some of the humiliation I'd suffered. I stepped out of the shower and wrapped myself in an old terry cloth robe, a gift from Eleanor for some long-forgotten holiday. It smelled of laundry detergent and a little of her perfume, though perhaps that was just a play of imagination. I walked to the kitchen, pulled a bottle of whiskey out of the kitchen cabinet, not the expensive kind I brought to barbecues, but the simple but good scotch I always kept for myself. I poured 2 fingers into the glass and took a big gulp, feeling a hot wave roll down my throat, warming me from the inside out. The clock in the living room read 9:30 in the evening. It was so early, and it seemed like an eternity since I'd walked into Barnaby and Ottilia's house with a bottle of whiskey and naive hopes of a pleasant family evening. With glass in hand, I made my way to my workshop, the one place in the house where I always felt truly at peace. I turned on the light, and the glass eyes of dozens of stuffed animals stared back at me. When I was young, I often joked that they were my most grateful audience. They never criticized and always listened attentively. Now that joke seemed bitter. I sank into the old leather chair by my desk and took another sip of whiskey. How many years had Ottilia methodically humiliated me? At first it had been little things, a slightly condescending tone, a subtle grimace when I talked about my work. Then it got worse. blatant jokes about Grandpa the Weirdo, defiantly ignoring my words at the family table. And Barnaby, my own flesh and blood son, was gradually drifting away from me, falling more and more under the influence of his ambitious wife. Now he couldn't even stand up for me when I was humiliated in front of dozens of people. Next to the chair stood an old stuffed owl, one of my first works, imperfect but dear to my heart. I stroked its feathers, faded with time. "What shall we do, old one?" I asked aloud. "Just accept that my son is lost to me? That this woman will continue to wipe her feet on me?" The owl didn't answer, of course, but in her glassy eyes I sensed something like understanding. Years ago, Eleanor had called this owl my totem animal, a silent, attentive observer who sees more than he seems to. My musings were interrupted by a phone call. I reluctantly glanced at the screen and was surprised to see the name Geneva Tumbler, my neighbor. "Alistair," her voice sounded concerned. "Are you okay?" "More or less," I answered, surprised by her call. "Why?" "I was at that barbecue at your son's house. Saw what happened by the pool." I felt the color rush back to my face. "You were there? I didn't see you." "I'm not surprised. Your sister-in-law made sure we were seated far away from each other. I was shoved to the edge of the table next to some boring banker." I smiled involuntarily. Geneva always spoke her mind bluntly. "I didn't realize you knew Attili." "Oh, we don't really know each other. She comes into my store sometimes, pretends to be interested in antiques. She's really just a gossip columnist. Who bought what? Who's interested in what? You know, information is currency to her." I chuckled. "That's an accurate observation." "Anyway," Geneva continued, "what she did was disgusting. I left right after you. I couldn't stay in the company of those—" She didn't finish the sentence, but I understood perfectly. "Thank you, Geneva. I appreciate your support." There was a pause, and I thought that would be the end of it. But Geneva suddenly spoke in a different tone, quieter, more conspiratorial. "You know, there's something I've wanted to tell you for a long time. I just wasn't sure it was any of my business. But after today—" "What is it?" I leaned forward involuntarily, though she couldn't see it. "Do you remember Michael Dawson, who worked at the city archives?" Vaguely. I think he moved somewhere else a couple of years ago." "Bristol. But before he left, he came into my store and we got to talking. He mentioned your sister-in-law, said he knew her before she moved to Easton." I felt my pulse quicken. "What did he say?" "Well, for one thing, she had a different last name back then, and she definitely wasn't from an old aristocratic family, like she told everyone. Michael said she worked as a secretary at some tiny little real estate agency, and there seemed to be some ugly story about clients' money, but he didn't know the details." I gripped the phone tighter. Something inside me resonated. It was like the pieces of a puzzle were starting to fit together. "Are you sure it's the same woman?" "Positive. He even showed me a picture from some corporate event. There she was, only with a different hairstyle and a little fuller. But it's definitely Ottilia." I remembered the folder I'd found during the movie, and Ottilia's reaction when she caught me with it. "Geneva, do you remember what last name she had back then?" Something simple." "Smith?" "No, not Smith." She paused, remembering. "Taylor." "Right, Taylor. It's a very common last name. Taylor. Nothing to do with the aristocratic greater surname that Ottilia was so proud of." "When was that?" "Before she met Barnaby. From what Michael said, about a year before she showed up in Easton. She suddenly quit the agency and disappeared. And then he'd seen her picture in the local paper, already as Ottilia Grider, at some charity event." My brain was working feverishly. If Ottilia isn't who she says she is, it explains a lot. Her paranoid desire for status and recognition, her constant tales of family tradition and upbringing in the best schools. It was all a lie, a mask she created. "Thank you, Geneva," I said at last. "That's very interesting. I thought you should know, especially after today. That woman has no right to treat you like that, Alistair, especially since she's not who she says she is." We talked for a few more minutes, about the Geneva store, about the weather, about the upcoming festival in Easton, the usual safe topics, but my thoughts were far away. I was thinking about the folder, about Ottilia's lie, about how that information could change everything. Listen, Geneva said before saying goodbye. What are you going to do with what I told you? I don't know, I answered honestly. I'm just thinking about it. I understand, but if you decide to do something about it, I'm on your side, you know. Thank you, Geneva. It means a lot to me. We said goodbye and I put the phone on the table. Sat for a long time looking at my collection of stuffed animals, as if waiting for advice from them. A fox with a sly squint, a deer with its head held proudly up, that owl with the sage's gaze. They were all silent, leaving me to decide what to do next. I suddenly remembered that I still had my spare key to Barnaby's house. He'd given it to me 3 years ago when they'd first moved in, just in case. I'd never used it, forgotten it even existed. But now it might come in handy. I got up and went into my office, opened the top drawer of my desk. I rummaged through the papers and found what I was looking for. A small key on a keychain in the shape of a fish. A reminder of when Barnaby and I used to go fishing together. If what Geneva had said was true, the evidence was probably in the very folder Ottilia had so hastily taken from me. And if she keeps such secrets, she probably keeps them somewhere in the house. Probably in her office. The barbecue will probably go on for a few more hours. Everyone will be in the garden. No one will go upstairs where the bedrooms and offices are. I have a chance. But should I? It's one thing to suspect your sister-in-law of lying, and quite another to sneak into her house going through her things. It's illegal, it's immoral, it violates every principle that has guided me all my life. I'd never stooped to dirty tricks, even when it might have benefited me. On the other hand, I remembered her face when she pushed me into the pool. Her laughter, the humiliation I'd experienced, years of small and large insults, of being ignored, of being condescended to. And now these lies, perhaps she's not only deceiving society, but my son as well. Shouldn't I protect him? I twirled the key in my hands, weighing the pros and cons. I thought about just calling Barnaby, telling him what I'd learned from Geneva, but would he believe me? Or would he think it was just an attempt to avenge my humiliation? Without proof, I'm worthless. No, I need that file. I need documents, pictures, something concrete that will make him see the truth. I glanced at the clock, almost 10 o'clock at night. The party's probably in full swing. If I wanted to act, there was no better time. The decision was forming gradually, but inevitably. I could no longer just sit back and accept everything she did. I couldn't watch her manipulate my son, alienate him from me, build her life on lies and deceit. I stood up, feeling something awaken inside that I hadn't felt in a very long time. Determination, not passive acceptance, not silent swallowing of resentment, but a real burning determination to act. After changing into dry clothes, dark pants and a black sweater, I put the key in my pocket. Before leaving, I glanced at myself in the mirror in the hallway. Gray hair, wrinkles around my eyes, deep creases around my mouth. Yes, I'm an old man, but not a helpless one. Do they want to see me as a pathetic old man? I thought, looking at my reflection. Well, I'll show them that old wolves bite harder than young ones. At exactly 10 o'clock that evening, I was back at Barnaby and Ottilia's house, parked on a neighboring street so my car wouldn't attract attention. As I approached the house, I could hear music and laughter from the garden. The party was in full swing. I walked around the house from the side of the garage. There was a side entrance that led directly into the kitchen. Not many people knew about it, but I remembered from when I was helping my son settle in. The key slid easily into the lock. My heart was pounding like crazy as I carefully opened the door and slipped inside. The kitchen was dark and quiet. Everyone was having fun in the garden. I froze for a few seconds, listening, but other than the muffled music outside, I heard nothing. I knew Ottilia's office was on the second floor, next to the master bedroom. Carefully, trying not to make any noise, I climbed the stairs. There were almost no sounds of the party on the second floor, just the distant hum of voices and music. The corridor was dimly lit. Only a nightlight against the far wall provided minimal illumination to keep me from stumbling around in the dark. I walked past Barnaby and Ottilia's bedroom, past the guest room, and stopped in front of the door to her study. Took a deep breath and turned the knob. It was locked. Surely she wouldn't leave the door open to the room where she kept her secrets. I examined the door carefully. The lock was simple, a regular latch that could be opened with a thin object. I had an old plastic card in my pocket, a pool membership that I hadn't used in years. I slipped it into the gap between the door and the jamb, right at the lock, and pressed it lightly, moving it up and down. After a few seconds, there was a click, and the door was ajar. Skills learned in my youth when my friends and I climbed into abandoned houses came in handy half a century later. Who would have thought it? I entered the study and quietly closed the door behind me. The room was decorated with Attilia's characteristic cold elegance. Minimalist furniture, mostly in whites and grays. No personal photos or knickknacks. Only on the wall hung framed certificates and diplomas, probably evidence of her brilliant education. It was risky to turn on the overhead light. It might be seen outside. Instead, I pulled out the small flashlight I'd always carried with me since I started losing my vision early in the twilight. After illuminating the room, I began to systematically look around the room, starting with the desk. The drawers were locked, but the locks on them were even simpler than those on the door, ordinary clerical locks that opened even with a light pressure. The drawers contained the usual office supplies, invoices, documents related to her work in the administration. Nothing interesting or compromising. I moved to the bookcase that took up an entire wall, neatly arranged books, mostly trendy business bestsellers and books on the psychology of success. Not a single tattered tome, not a single book that had clearly been reread many times. All for looks. I cautiously looked through shelf after shelf, not quite sure what I was looking for. A stash of books, perhaps? Or a book safe? A folder like that would be hard to hide in a standard bookcase. And then I noticed that one section of the bookcase was protruding slightly forward, almost imperceptibly, just a couple of millimeters. I moved closer and shined my flashlight on the side of the bookcase. Indeed, that section was slightly offset. I tried pulling on the edge. Nothing. I pressed it down, also to no avail. Then I tried to move the section to the right, and it smoothly pulled away, opening a small niche in the wall. There in that niche was a familiar cardboard folder. My heart beat even harder. I carefully pulled the folder out and placed it on the table. I opened it. Inside were documents, photographs, newspaper clippings, exactly what I'd glimpsed 3 years ago. But now I could look at them more closely. The first thing that caught my eye was the name change certificate. Olivia Taylor had officially changed her name to Ottilia Grader 4 years ago, about 6 months before I'd met Barnaby. Next, a degree from a prestigious university in the name of Ottilia Grider. But if you look closely, you could see that it was an elaborate forgery, slightly different fonts, not quite accurate printing. The photographs showed a young Ottilia, then Olivia, in the company of people who looked nothing like the aristocratic family she described. Ordinary middle-class people, judging by their clothes and surroundings. And most interesting of all, a newspaper clipping from the local newspaper of a small town. The headline read, "Employee of real estate agency suspected of fraud." The text of the article described how one Olivia Taylor, who worked at the Home Finder agency, was suspected of embezzling money from clients. The case did not go to court. According to the reporter, the affected clients were compensated and the suspect resigned of her own accord. I sat, stunned, trying to make sense of the finding. Ottilia, or should I say Olivia, had built her new life on a lie. Made up an aristocratic background, an education, a wealthy family. And all these years she's used those lies to gain a foothold in Easton high society, to win the favor of the powerful, and to get my son. Poor Barnaby. He had no idea who he was committing his life to. The woman he thought was a sophisticated heiress to an ancient family was a con artist, changing names and biographies to hide her dubious past. What should I do with this information? The thought of just letting it go after all, Barnaby chose her, and maybe she does make him happy, despite her flaws. But then I remembered the pool, her mocking face. Cool it, old man. She went too far, made my son ashamed of me, broke our bond, humiliated me at every opportunity. And all the while she was a liar herself, a con artist who built her life on lies. I neatly put the documents back in the folder, but instead of returning it to its hiding place, I stuffed it under my sweater. I turned around, shined my flashlight around the room, making sure I'd left no trace of my presence, and quietly walked out, closing the door carefully behind me. As I walked down the stairs, I heard the music getting louder. Someone must have turned it up. Perfect for me. Less chance of someone hearing my footsteps. Leaving the house the same way I came in, I quickly crossed the side of the yard and headed for my car. I put the folder on the passenger seat and sat down, pondering my next move. I could just drive home, study the documents more thoroughly, maybe make copies and send them to Barnaby later. That would have been the cautious route, giving me time to think things through. But part of me, the part that was still seething with humiliation, wanted immediate retribution. I wanted to see Otilia's face when her lies were exposed in front of all those people she'd worked so hard to impress. I started the car and drove a few blocks to the nearest convenience store. I bought a bottle of expensive wine, the same kind they served at the party. It would be my pass back. Back at my son's house, I parked in the driveway, no longer hiding. I pulled the folder out from under my sweater and put it in the bag along with the wine. I took a deep breath, gathering my wits. What I was about to do would forever change my relationship with my son. He might never forgive me for exposing his wife so publicly. But isn't it better to let him live a lie? Shouldn't I protect him from the woman who deceived him from the beginning? I got out of the car and headed toward the backyard, where the sounds of music and voices were coming from. The guests were still partying, even though it was almost 11 o'clock in the evening. As I entered the garden, I saw that the atmosphere had become more relaxed. People were dancing, laughing, some were swimming in the pool. Otilia was standing in the center of a group of guests, saying something that made everyone around her laugh. Barnaby noticed me first. His face expressed a mixture of surprise and alarm. He came toward me quickly, looking around as if he was afraid someone might see us talking. "Dad?" His voice sounded tense. "You're back? But you were soaking wet." "I changed," I answered calmly. "I decided I shouldn't let one little incident ruin the evening." He looked embarrassed but relieved at the same time. That's very mature of you. Look, about what happened, Otilia didn't mean—" "It's okay," I interrupted him. "I don't hold a grudge. In fact, I even brought a bottle of wine as a gesture of reconciliation." I took the bottle out of the bag, leaving the folder inside. Barnaby smiled uncertainly. "This is very unexpected, but I'm glad you're back. I really am." "Where is Otilia?" I asked, even though I could see her in the crowd of guests. "I want to apologize personally for my temper." "She's over there with the guests," Barnaby pointed in the direction of the group of people. "Come on, I'll show you out." We approached Otilia, who was just finishing some story that had caused another burst of laughter. When she saw me, she froze, her smile strained. "Alistair?" She sounded surprised. "You? Back?" "Yes." I smiled the kindest smile I could muster. I figured I shouldn't let a little misunderstanding ruin such a lovely evening. She gave me a suspicious look, clearly not trusting my sudden change of mood. "How generous of you." "I even brought wine." I handed her the bottle. "As an apology for my temper." Otilia reluctantly accepted the bottle, still looking wary. "Thank you, but I should have been the one to apologize. That incident at the pool, it was just a joke, but I was out of line." She sounded insincere, like a learned phrase. Barnaby must have made her prepare this apology in case I ever showed up at their house again. "Forget it," I said with a wave of my hand. "What do you say we open this bottle and drink to reconciliation?" Barnaby brightened up. "That's a great idea. I'll get the glasses." While he went off to get glasses, I was alone with Otilia. She looked at me with ill-concealed suspicion. "What are you up to, Alistair?" she asked quietly so that none of the guests would hear. "A plan?" I feigned surprise. "Just trying to smooth over an unpleasant incident. Isn't that what you want?" "I've known you long enough to know you're not the kind of person who just forgives and forgets. People change, Otilia. Or let's just say, sometimes they're not who they say they are." Her eyes widened slightly, but at that moment Barnaby returned with glasses and a corkscrew. He quickly opened the wine and poured it into glasses. "Suriname, to reconciliation," he said with a smile, raising his glass. "I have a better idea," I said, pulling a folder out of the bag. "Let's drink to truth and family values." Otilia froze, her gaze fixed on the folder in my hands. The color slowly drained from her face. "What is it?" Barnaby asked, not noticing his wife's reaction. Oh, just some interesting documents I'd like to discuss, I replied, opening the folder, especially with our honored guests. By this point, several guests had already turned their attention to our little circle. The deputy mayor, Arthur Lynch, came closer, intrigued. What have you got there, Mr. Fernsby? He asked with polite interest. Sartobanton. You know Ottilia Grider, don't you, Mr. Lynch? I asked, pulling the name change certificate out of the folder. Or maybe you'd be more interested in meeting Olivia Taylor. I placed the document on the table next to us. Several of the guests moved closer, attracted by the unusual situation. Ottilia turned even paler. Her hand holding the glass was visibly trembling. Ellister, what are you doing? She hissed through her teeth. Just sharing some interesting facts about our family, I replied calmly. Like the fact that my daughter-in-law officially changed her name 6 months before she met my son. Interesting, isn't it? Barnaby shifted his confused gaze from me to his wife. Ottilia, what is he talking about? It's some ridiculous fiction, she said quickly, trying to keep her composure. Barnaby, your father is clearly... Here's another interesting document, I interrupted, pulling out a forged diploma. A diploma from Oxford University issued to Ottilia Grider. Very impressive, if it weren't for one small problem. It's a forgery. See that font? The real Oxford diplomas use a completely different font. I put the diploma next to the name change certificate. The circle of spectators had widened. Now almost all the guests were gathered around us, attracted by the unfolding drama. And here, perhaps, is the most interesting item in our little exhibition, I continued, pulling out a newspaper clipping. An article from the Brentwood Herald, dated June 5, 2021. Employee of real estate agency suspected of fraud. The protagonist is one Olivia Taylor, who, by a remarkable coincidence, looks a lot like our Ottilie. I placed the clipping next to the rest of the papers. A whisper ran through the guests. Someone leaned over to get a better look at the picture in the paper. It's a lie, Ottilia almost shouted. Her perfect mask of composure finally cracked. Barnaby, don't listen to him. He's just getting back at me for that incident at the pool. Barnaby stared at the documents, his face growing paler by the second. Ottilia, is it true? You're not who you say you are? Of course not. Her voice sounded almost hysterical. I've always been honest with you. Then explain this. He pointed to the name change certificate. Is it a forgery? If so, we can easily check with the proper authorities. Ottilia opened her mouth, then closed it. Her gaze darted between the documents, the guests, and Barnaby. Okay, she finally said, apparently deciding to change tactics. Yes, I changed my name. What's the big deal? A lot of people do it. Olivia's such a, ordinary name. I wanted something more, unique. What about a fake diploma? I asked. Is that also a quest for uniqueness? It's not fake, she objected. It's a copy. The original was lost, so I ordered a duplicate. An unofficial office that produces fake diplomas? I asked with feigned surprise. Interesting choice. Arthur Lynch, the deputy mayor, scrutinized the documents. He raised his head and looked at Ottilie with cold interest. Mrs. Fernsby, I'm no expert on Oxford diplomas, but even I can see that there's something wrong with this one. And given that you work in city government, where a college degree is required, that's a misunderstanding, Ottilia interrupted him. I can explain everything. One. What about this article? Barnaby asked, pointing to the newspaper clipping. Is that a misunderstanding too? Ottilia looked cornered. Her carefully constructed image was crumbling before the eyes of all the people she had tried so hard to look perfect in front of. It was a mistake, she finally said. I was slandered. I did nothing. But you don't deny that you did, insisted Barnaby. Ottilia was silent, and that silence was more eloquent than any words. I watched as my son's expression changed from disbelief to shock, then to anger, and finally to disappointment. He looked at his wife as if he was seeing her for the first time. All this time, he said quietly, everything you told me about your family, about your education, about your past, was it all a lie? Ottilia tried to take his hand, but he pulled away. Not all of it, she said quickly. I do love you, Barnaby. That was never a lie. But everything else was, his voice sounded cold. You made up another identity, another life for yourself. You made me believe that." He didn't finish the sentence, shaking his head. Around us, the guests were whispering, some of them staring openly at the unfolding family drama. Arthur Lynch cleared his throat. "I think we should all give the Fernsby family some space," he said, turning to the guests. "Mrs. Fernsby," he turned to Attilia, "I'd like to speak to you on Monday in my office. Given your position in the administration and these new circumstances, we have much to discuss." Attilia nodded, her face frozen in a mask of tense control. Arthur began to gather the guests, tactfully directing them toward the exit. People reluctantly dispersed, casting curious glances over his shoulder. When most of the guests had gone, it was just the three of us, me, Barnaby, and Ottilia, in the garden. A tense silence hung between us. "How could you?" Ottilia finally asked, looking at me with undisguised hatred. "How dare you rummage through my personal belongings? The same way you dared to make me a laughingstock in front of all your friends," I replied calmly. "The only difference is that I revealed the truth, and you've been living a lie all these years." "Dad," Barnaby turned to me, his face pale and gaunt. "Did you wait until all these people were here on purpose? Couldn't you have just tell me in private?" I felt a prick of conscience. Yes, I wanted public exposure. I wanted Ottilia to suffer the same humiliation I did. But the price was high, the pain in my son's eyes. "I wanted you to see her true face," I said, "for everyone to see. And that's why you broke into our house, her office?" His voice shook. It's illegal, Dad. It's an invasion of privacy." "He's right," Ottilia put in quickly. "We could sue you for it." "Go ahead," I shrugged. "It'll be interesting how you explain to the judge the origin of the fake diploma." Ottilia bit her lip, clearly realizing she'd backed herself into a corner. Barnaby ran a hand through his hair, looking utterly exhausted. "I want you both to leave," he said quietly. I need time to think." "Barnaby," Ottilia exclaimed, "you can't just—" "I can," he said firmly, "and I'm doing it. I don't know which of you to trust, and I'm not sure I want to deal with either of you right now." I felt something inside me snap. I'd gotten what I wanted. Attilia was exposed, her carefully constructed world was crumbling, but the price was higher than I expected. I could have lost my son. "Barnaby," I began, but he held up his hand to stop me. "No, Dad, not now. Please just go away." I nodded, gathered the papers back into the folder, and turned to leave. Ottilia stood with her arms crossed over her chest, her face contorted with a mixture of anger and fear. "This isn't over," she hissed as I walked past. "For you, it very well might be," I replied quietly. I walked out of the garden, leaving behind the ruins of the party and possibly my son's family. The victory was bitter, but I couldn't bring myself to regret what I had done. The truth, no matter how painful, is always better than a lie. It was a week after that ill-fated party, 7 days that changed everything in my life and in the life of our family. I sat on the veranda of my house, sipping my morning coffee and leafing through the local newspaper. On page 5, there was a small notice: "City employee fired for providing fake education documents." Ottilia's name wasn't mentioned, but Easton was already buzzing with rumors. Denby called me every day, reporting on the fallout from the expose. Apparently, news spreads faster than wildfire in a small town. By the evening of that day, practically everyone Ottilia knew about her double life. By the next morning, the story had grown in detail, some true, some made up. By the end of the week, there wasn't a single person left in the community to which Ottilia longed to belong who didn't know the truth. The ringing of the telephone interrupted my musings. It was Denby. "Well, old boy, how's the mood today?" "The usual," I answered, putting the paper aside. "Calm. Have you heard the latest news? Your sister-in-law has been officially fired from the administration. Arthur Lynch personally signed the order." I nodded, even though Denby couldn't see it. "I just read it in the paper." "Yeah, and that's not all," Denby said with barely concealed satisfaction. "Geneva told me she'd been kicked out of the sorority. You know, that snobbish circle where they drink tea and discuss charity. Elizabeth Hartley, their chairman, said she wouldn't tolerate a rogue in her ranks." "How quickly people change," I remarked without much joy. A week ago, they were all in awe of her aristocratic manners. It's always like that, Denby said with a snicker. Society loves to put people on a pedestal, but it loves to throw them off it even more. Crowd justice, so to speak. I took a sip of cold coffee. What about Barnaby? Any news? Denby was quiet for a moment, and I felt myself tense up, waiting for an answer. He's still with her, if that's what you mean. I sighed. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I hoped my son would come to his senses, see the situation clearly. But another part of me knew. Barnaby had always been too soft, too easily influenced, especially by a woman like Attilia. Had you tried to contact him? Denby asked. I called 3 times. He's not picking up. I sent a message, just to see how he was doing. I haven't heard back. Give him time, Alistair. He's in a tough spot right now. I know, I rubbed the bridge of my nose. It's just, he's my son, Denby. I didn't want to hurt him, but you did what you thought was right, and it was the damn right thing to do. That woman lied to everyone for years, including your son. She manipulated him, turned him against you. Someone had to expose the truth. I nodded, useless again for a phone conversation. Okay, I won't bother you anymore, Denby said. I'll come by your place in about 2 hours when I get off. I'll bring that new taxidermy tool you asked for, and a nice bottle of scotch. I'll be waiting. I hung up the phone and looked at the paper again. A small note, a few lines, and a whole life shattered to the ground. I didn't feel the triumph I'd expected. Revenge had turned out to be a dish not only cold, but tasteless. The doorbell rang. I glanced at my watch in surprise. It was still a long way from Denby's arrival. When I opened the door, I froze in surprise. Barnaby stood on the doorstep. He looked gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes as if he hadn't slept a few nights in a row. He was dressed sloppily, in old jeans and a crumpled shirt, not the style Attilia had taught him. Barnaby! I couldn't hide my surprise. Come in. He walked into the house looking around as if he were here for the first time, though he'd grown up within these walls. We went into the kitchen, and I offered him coffee. No thanks, his voice sounded dry. I won't be long. We sat down at the kitchen table. Barnaby put his hands in front of him and interlocked his fingers nervously. I came to tell you that Attilia and I are leaving Easton. I felt something clench inside. Leaving? Going where? Bristol. I've got a job offer from an engineering firm there. We've decided it's better to start fresh. There's too much here. Too much has happened here. I watched my son carefully, trying to read his real feelings behind the mask of tired indifference. Is this your decision or hers? Barnaby looked up, a flicker of irritation in his eyes. Ours in common. We're a family, Dad. We make decisions together. Even after what you found out about her. I couldn't help myself. After all the lies? He took a deep breath, clearly holding back his emotions. Yes, she had lied about her past, about her name, her education, her family. But you know what? I don't care. I don't love her for her pedigree or her diploma. I love her for who she is now with me. And who is she, Barnaby? Are you sure you know? I know enough, he straightened up. Enough to know that she was so insecure, so afraid of being a nobody, that she created a new identity. It's sad, Dad. It requires understanding, not judgment. I shook my head. How easily she'd circled him again, turned herself from a liar and manipulator into a tragic figure deserving of sympathy. Sakim, what about the way she treated me all those years ago? How she humiliated you, ridiculed you, alienated you from me? It was wrong, Barnaby agreed, and she admits it. But you know what was wrong too? What you did at that party. You could have come to me, shown me those documents in private. Instead, you staged a public execution. You wanted to humiliate her the way she humiliated you. I wanted everyone to see the truth, I said firmly. No, Dad, you wanted revenge. And you got it. Attilia lost her job, her reputation, all her friends. Are you happy? I didn't say anything. The truth was, I didn't feel the satisfaction I expected. I've come to tell you that we're leaving at the end of the month, Barnaby continued. And another thing, I think we'd better take a break from talking. For a while. Are you breaking up with me? I asked bluntly. I don't call it that. It's just, we need time and space. I need to rebuild my family, focus on the future. Attilia's pregnant, Dad. That news hit me over the head like a hammer. Pregnant? But, when? How long have you known? She found out the day before the party. She wanted to surprise everyone, to announce it instead. He didn't finish the sentence, but I understood. Instead of a joyous announcement of a grandchild, I made a revelation that ruined everything. Aramakin, Barnaby, I didn't know. Of course you didn't know, he stood up, because you didn't even think to ask. You didn't think of the consequences. You were too busy getting your revenge. I stood up too, feeling the despair growing inside. Son, please, don't do this. Don't leave like this. We can talk, find a way. No, Dad, his voice was resolute. The decision has been made. We're leaving, and I'm asking you to respect our desire to spend some time away from all of this. I could see in his eyes that it was useless to argue. Ottilia had won again. Somehow she had managed to turn my exposé into a story about how an abusive father-in-law had ruined a happy moment in a young family's life. I'll miss you, I said quietly, and I'll be waiting for you when you're ready to repair our relationship. Barnaby nodded, but didn't say anything. He headed for the exit, and I walked him to the door. He hugged me briefly, a formal gesture that lacked any real warmth. Take care of yourself, Dad, he said before he left. I stood at the window, watching him get into the car and drive away, probably for the last time. Denby arrived as promised 2 hours later. He noticed my mood right away. What's the matter? You look like you buried someone? In a way, I answered and told him about Barnaby's visit. Denby listened without interrupting, only shaking his head at particularly dramatic moments. When I finished, he whistled. Gee, so she's pregnant? And they're leaving? Yes. And it looks like I'm losing my son for good. Don't be silly, Denby pulled a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses out of his bag. He's in shock right now. Imagine finding out in 1 week that your wife isn't who she says she is. Losing your friends, your reputation. He needs something to hold on to. And right now it's her and the baby. He poured us both a nice drink and raised his glass. Shornik to a new chapter in your life. No matter what happens, you did the right thing. We drank, and I felt the whiskey burn my throat, a pleasant, distracting sensation. Let's go to the workshop, I suggested. I'll show you what I'm working on. We walked to my old taxidermy shop, a place where I always felt in my element. I had recently started a new project, a stuffed fox found dead on the side of the road. It was in great condition, and I decided to give it a second life. It's a beautiful specimen, Denby said as he looked at my work. You haven't lost your skills. Some things you don't forget. I ran my hand over the red fur. You know, the fox has always been my favorite animal to work with. Such a cunning, adaptive creature. Survives where others can't. Denby nodded, taking a seat on the stool next to my desk. Reminds me of someone I know, he winked at me. I smiled for the first time all day. I don't think I'm particularly sneaky, more like stubborn. Stubborn, honest, and principled, Denby agreed. A real Fernsby, as I understand it. Maybe the last real Fernsby, I sighed, thinking of Barnaby and his unborn child, whom I might never see again. Who knows, though? Maybe someday Barnaby will understand. He will, Denby said confidently. Maybe not right away, but he will. The truth has a way of coming out over time, especially when you're dealing with someone like Attilia. What do you mean? Well, think about it. A woman who's been lying all her life suddenly becomes honest and repentant? I doubt it. She'll probably continue her manipulations, and sooner or later, Barnaby would see that. I nodded thoughtfully, working a section of foxhide with a tool. Hopefully by then, it wouldn't be too late. It's never too late for some things, Denby said philosophically, especially for seeing the truth. We worked in silence for a while, me on the fox, Denby helping me with the small details like the old days when he'd sometimes come into my workshop after work. Sure. You know what I realized after all this? I finally said. Family legacy is not just a family name. It's the values, the principles, the dignity with which you carry that family name. That's right, Denby nodded. And you've kept that dignity, Alistair. No matter what. But at what cost? I shook my head. I lost my son. Not forever. Denby put his hand on my shoulder. Give him time. He'll come back when he's ready. In the meantime, you have your life, your art, he circled the studio, and friends who will always be there for you. I smiled gratefully. Denby always had a way with words. And who knows, he continued. Maybe one day you'll get a letter or a phone call. Dad, it's me, Barnaby. I want you to meet your grandson. That would be wonderful. I struggled to contain my emotions. Anything is possible. Denby raised his glass. To the future, whatever it may be. I raised my glass and repeated quietly, to the future. We continued working on the fox. The red predator gradually took shape under my hands, its eyes seeming to look with a sly wisdom, as if it knew something beyond human comprehension. It will be beautiful, Denby said, watching me work. Yes, I agreed, polishing the fox's glass eye. She'll outlive us all. She'll look at the world with her sly eyes long after we're gone. Philosophically inclined today, huh? I shrugged. Nawi, taxidermy makes you think about eternity, about memory, about what's left behind. Maybe my name won't continue through the generations. Maybe I really am the last true Fernsby. But something of me will remain. My work, my principles, my story. In the memory of a man who wasn't afraid to stand up for the truth, even when it wasn't easy, Denby added. I smiled as I looked at the almost finished fox. Her muzzle seemed to express the same thing I was feeling at that moment. A quiet determination, an acceptance of life as it was, with its joys and sorrows, its victories and defeats. You know, I said, putting the instrument aside, for the first time in a long time, I feel a strange calmness, like I've finally done something I should have done a long time ago. You stood up for yourself, Denby said simply. That always brings peace to the soul, even if the outcome isn't quite what you'd hoped for. I nodded, looking at my hands, the hands of a master, the hands that had created hundreds of works of art, the hands that had once held my son's little hands as I led him to his first day of school. These hands can still create many beautiful things. This life can still bring much joy. And who knows what the future will bring. I picked up the tool and went back to work, feeling strangely peaceful. The Fernsby name might be gone after me, but what it meant, honesty, integrity, craftsmanship, would remain. In my work, in my actions, and perhaps someday in my son's heart.